female fox who just gave birth has so much milk that she can't finish it all. To ease its pain and avoid wasting resources, it captured pythons, weasels, porcupines and mice to nurse them with milk. Yet it couldn't solve the root problem. At this moment the mother fox had a sudden idea. It rushed down the mountain intending to steal human babies from the village. Wanted to see if this could alleviate its lingering agony. However, halfway down the mountain, it encountered an old man hunting. Without hesitation the old man tied the fox up and took it home. The wise old man immediately knew why the fox had come down the mountain. Turned out the old man wanted to taste the fox's milk too. But just as the old man was about to act, the fox suddenly transformed into a woman. The woman begged the old man, promising that if he let her go, she would bless his family with fortune in the future. Reluctantly the old man released her back into the wild. The very next day, a once-in-a-century flood struck the village. Hundreds of villagers drowned in the disaster. But somehow our family's low-lying home remained untouched. Angry villagers blamed their household gods, complaining that they hadn't been warned in a dream. In rage they smashed their ancestral shrines to pieces. From then on no pregnant woman in the village could give birth to a healthy child. All of them either had premature births or stillborn babies. And strangely the fetuses were not human, but snakes, porcupines or underdeveloped mice. Terrified the younger villagers began to flee. When my mother was about to give birth to me, my father was terrified I'd be a monster. But my grandfather wasn't afraid at all. He prepared 9 hens, 9 drakes, 9 pigeons and 9 pairs of quails. A total of 45 birds filling an entire cart. He also packed a basket of eggs, 2 boxes of tea and 3 flasks of wine. With these he set off deep into the mountains. He was gone for 5 days and nights. At dawn on the 6th day he returned with an empty cart. The first thing he did upon seeing my parents was laugh and say, "Our child's fate is secured." Skeptical my parents asked how he had managed it. Grandfather revealed that he had arranged a marriage for me. The cart full of offerings was the bride price. He guaranteed that I would be born safely and grow up well. The only condition was that at age 10, I had to return to the village to marry a fiancé I'd never met. At first my parents didn't believe him, but a few days later I was born without any issues. On the day of my birth, a group of white foxes gathered in our courtyard. They bowed 3 times toward the birthing room. While my mother was recovering, every morning on our windowsill, we'd find a fresh wild pheasant. Grandfather said the fresh pheasants were gifts from my future mother-in-law. He also claimed I was destined to marry a fox spirit. So he named me Lin Hu Jun, Fox Lord Lin. I became the only child in the village, born safely after the flood. While other families birthed snakes or mice, our family had a chubby healthy boy. But the villagers grew jealous of us. They called me unlucky, a jinx, and said I was sent by evil spirits to curse the village. My parents couldn't bear the rumors. When I was 6 we moved to the county town. Then at the age of 17, news arrived that my grandfather had passed away. Upon hearing the bad news, I decided to return to the village to arrange his funeral. But my parents tried to stop me at all costs. They said my second uncle would handle everything. Ignoring their protests I rushed to the village that same day. I took the long-distance bus back to my old home. When I arrived at the front gate, I saw black and white mourning banners, and a large white flower hanging on the door. But something felt off. There were no neighbors in sight, nor did I see my second uncle anywhere. Instead the courtyard was filled with foxes of all sizes. As soon as I arrived, the foxes parted to make way for me. Then from inside the courtyard, I heard a soft melodious voice calling, "Hu Jun, you've returned." I shivered involuntarily, since the village had offended the 5 spirits. No other living child had been born here for 20 years. I was the only surviving child in the entire village. So where did this young girl come from? With countless questions in my mind, I gathered my courage and stepped into the courtyard. There I saw my grandfather's memorial hall, set up in the northern room of the house. In the center of the room was a bright red coffin. Beside the coffin stood a figure. It was a young girl around 17 years old. I stood there stunned. Without any surprise, she greeted me naturally. "Hu Jun, you've returned. I knew you'd come back to send grandfather off." I paused for a moment stammering, Who are you?" The girl smiled saying, "You fool. I'm your betrothed." Grandfather had always told me that I was engaged to marry a fox spirit, but I never really believed him. It wasn't until I saw this beautiful bride that I had no choice but to believe it was true. You're a fox spirit?" "Yes." She nodded. "I'm the 9th in my family and my mother calls me Xiao Ju." "You're my betrothed, just call me Ju Mei." Seeing that I was speechless she suddenly lifted her snow-white dress. She shook it and said, "Look, I still have a tail." I looked closely and saw, beneath her gown, 6 fluffy foxtails. Xiao Ju glanced at grandfather's coffin and said, "Come offer incense for him. Grandfather's greatest wish was for you to send him off. He will rest peacefully." But instead of offering incense I asked, "How did grandfather die? He was perfectly healthy during the new year. How could he just pass away like that?" At my question Xiao Ju's expression shifted, hesitant to respond. She avoided giving me a clear answer. I knew something was wrong. Without hesitation I stepped forward and lifted the coffin lid. Hu Jun, what are you doing? Xiao Ju asked nervously. I need to see how grandfather died, I said through clenched teeth. Don't look. What good will it do to know? Xiao Ju tried to dissuade me. I ignored her and opened the lid. Grandfather's body lay before me. He was resting quietly in the coffin, but his eyes were wide open. He hadn't died in peace. The moment I saw his body, chills ran down my spine. His wrists and ankles were pierced by long sharp spines. They looked like porcupine quills. His fingers and toes were chewed and bloodied. It looked like mice had gnawed at them. His ankles and calves were covered in rows of tiny bite marks. Judging by the bite marks, it must have been a weasel. His lips were purple, his face was blue, and his eyes were swollen shut. It was obvious he had been poisoned by a snake. Fox, weasel, white snake, willow, and gray rat. Among the 5 spirits, only the Fox clan spared us. The other 4 conspired to kill my grandfather. I knew it. Grandfather did not die peacefully. The weasel, white snake, willow, and gray rat. They were the ones who killed him. I shouted in grief. Xiao Ju nodded softly. It was their doing. Your village offended the 5 spirits, and they vowed to wipe out your entire bloodline. But your grandfather once saved my mother's life, and he came to our house with a sincere proposal. My mother took pity on you, so she allowed you to be born safely. You were given life to become my husband. When the other 4 spirits found out, they came to make trouble for you. Your grandfather took on your fate, bearing your life mark in your place. He became your scapegoat, and they killed him. Hearing this, I was overwhelmed with sorrow. Without grandfather, I wouldn't have been born safely into this world. And now he had sacrificed his life for me once again. I owed him far too much. Xiao Ju spoke again. Now that your grandfather has taken your place, the spirit's grudge against your family is over. After you offer incense and bow before him, you must leave before nightfall. Don't let the spirits discover you're still alive. Your grandfather's death will be in vain if they do. Our marriage will be annulled. From now on, don't return to the village. The spirits won't harm you if you stay away. But I couldn't accept it. No, they killed my grandfather. I'll make them pay. They're nothing but a pack of vile beasts. I'll fight them. I promised grandfather I'd marry you. This is the one thing I swore to do for him. I'll fulfill this promise even if it costs my life. As soon as I finished speaking, Xiao Ju burst into laughter. I asked her, why are you laughing? She gave me a sly glance. I'm laughing because my future husband is truly a man of honor. If you had just walked away, I would have looked down on you. But the 4 spirits are ruthless. Staying might cost you your life. Are you sure you won't regret it? I shook my head and said no regrets. I glanced at Xiao Ju, who looked like an ethereal goddess, and couldn't help but confess. If I left now, where would I ever find a bride as beautiful as you? Xiao Ju chuckled playfully. You sure know how to speak the truth. Then she glanced at the sky and said with concern, the night is falling soon. It's not safe after dark. The spirits will roam the village tonight. I'll confront them outside the old house. You need to find a safe place to hide. Otherwise you might be in danger. I asked where should I hide. She looked around the room. Then she pointed to the space beside grandfather's coffin. You'll have to sleep in here tonight. I turned to look, feeling helpless. Next to grandfather's coffin, there was a larger coffin. It was an asterisk outer shell called a asterisk shroud. It's used to encase the inner coffin. I'm supposed to sleep in there? Xiao Ju nodded. Yes, pretend to be dead. Only the dead won't be harmed by the spirits. And no matter what noises you hear, do not leave the coffin. At dusk Xiao Ju helped me climb inside. As I lay down she gave me 3 warnings. First, no matter what noises you hear in the courtyard, don't look outside. Second, no matter who speaks to you, don't respond. Third, before dawn, you must not leave the coffin. Got it? I nodded and said got it. She then placed the lid over the coffin, leaving only a narrow gap for air. And now the night had fully descended, and inside the coffin it was pitch black. I couldn't even see my own hand in front of me. All I could smell was the scent of wood and varnish. I lay there as still as a corpse. To say I wasn't scared would be a lie. But I didn't dare move a muscle. I forced myself to close my eyes and sleep. But just as I started to drift off, I suddenly heard Xiao Ju return. She knocked on the coffin lid and whispered, Hu Jun, there's one more thing I forgot to tell you. Open the lid and I'll tell you. I opened my eyes about to respond, when I suddenly remembered the 3 rules. Even if I heard Xiao Ju's voice, I wasn't supposed to respond or look outside, because the voice outside might not be the real Xiao Ju. Realizing this, I kept my mouth shut tight. No matter what the voice outside said, I didn't respond. After knocking for a while, the voice grew impatient. Hu Jun, say something. Lin Hu Jun, have you gone mute? Say something. I have something important to tell you. Open the lid quick. Voice grew sharper, almost screeching, like nails scraping against glass. Lin Hu Jun opened the coffin. Open it. Terrified, I curled up inside the coffin, too scared to move a muscle. I thought to myself, thank goodness I didn't fall for it. If I had responded, I wouldn't have known how I died. The screeching outside continued for half an hour, before it finally faded away. I stayed inside the coffin, not daring to breathe. I felt as scared as a Teletubby. After a while, I began to relax a bit. I was just about to close my eyes for a nap, when I suddenly heard two familiar voices outside the coffin. Hu Jun, where are you? We told you not to come back for the funeral but you didn't listen. Look at the trouble you've caused. One voice sounded like my father's, the other like my mother's. But I was fully alert. I knew these voices were fake. Just like the earlier voice of Xiaoju, I kept my mouth shut, ignoring them, but the voices kept calling. Hu Jun, where are you? Dear, do you think our Hu Jun was killed by the spirits? Hu Jun, answer us, please. Your mother is so worried. The voices were identical to my parents. They sounded so real. If I hadn't nearly been tricked earlier, I might have fallen for it this time. After a while when I didn't respond, the voices outside changed tactics. Suddenly the voices became panicked and desperate. Stay away from us. Let go of your grudges. It's the 5 spirits that killed you, not us. Don't come after us for revenge. Go away. Leave us alone. Stay back. We have no guilty conscience. We're not afraid of ghosts. Then came gut-wrenching screams, followed by desperate cries. It sounded like my parents outside were being attacked by vengeful spirits. It all sounded so real I almost believed it. Thankfully I kept my wits about me. I didn't peek outside or say a word. I stayed completely silent. Gradually the voices of my parents grew weaker. Then they began to blame me. Hu Jun, your mother and I have suffered so much. You won't even take a look? Lin Hu Jun, you ungrateful child, it's all your fault. If you hadn't insisted on coming back for the funeral, we wouldn't have lost our lives too. I lay in the coffin keeping my mouth shut. No matter what they said, I didn't respond. After holding out for a while, they finally went silent. The courtyard felt completely quiet. I exhaled in relief. It was all a trick after all. Just as I was about to doze off, I heard another familiar voice beside my ear. My dear grandson, come out now. Everything's fine. The moment I heard that voice, my eyes welled up with tears. My throat tightened. It was my grandfather's voice. The voice continued, don't be afraid my boy. This was all part of my plan. I faked my death. I teamed up with the Fox clan to fool the other spirits. They fell for it. Everything outside is safe now. Come out my dear grandson. There's no danger anymore. As much as I missed my grandfather, and as close as we'd always been, I knew better. Deep down I knew the truth. The voice wasn't his. It couldn't be. I clenched my jaw, saying nothing. I kept my eyes shut, and didn't look outside the coffin. Seeing that I wasn't responding, the thing outside let out a sigh. In my grandfather's voice it said, my grandson, I've loved you all my life. Ever since you were in your mother's womb, I've worked tirelessly for you. Now that I'm leaving, won't you come out to see me off? Still I said nothing, keeping my eyes closed and staying perfectly still. The voice grew angrier. You ungrateful child, your grandfather won't rest in peace, even in the afterlife. With those words, the coffin suddenly began to shake violently. The lid rattled loudly. Terrified I curled up, hugging myself tightly, but I knew deep down, as long as I followed Xiaoju's advice, not to look outside the courtyard, not to talk to the voices and not to leave the coffin, those evil spirits couldn't harm me. Though I was scared, I stayed calm. Sure enough, the shaking stopped after a while, and the voices faded away. Finally I drifted off to sleep. I don't know how long I slept. Suddenly I felt something heavy pressing on me. I reached out to touch it. It was soft and fragrant. Felt like a woman lying on top of me. I thought the danger had passed, and I was dreaming, but in my half-asleep state, the overpowering scent of perfume woke me up. I realized something heavy was still on top of me. I reached out again. What I felt was soft and warm. The body of a woman. It was Xiaoju. My future bride was lying beside me. Realizing this, an idea struck me. I reached down to touch her backside. I carefully felt around. Then my heart sank. There was no tail. This wasn't Xiaoju, but I must admit, it felt pretty nice. The touch was quite pleasant. Before I could figure out who she was, she realized I was awake. She leaned forward, her breath fragrant like orchids. Hu Jun, she whispered, you've returned. It's been years. You've grown into a fine young man. And look how much you've grown. Hearing the seductive tone in her voice, I immediately recognized her. It was my 7th aunt, my 7th uncle's wife. They had married late, tying the knot when I was 5 years old. And my uncle, quite the cradle robber, was 9 years older than her. She was the youngest bride in the village, and coincidentally the prettiest. When she married in, every man in the village, from 60-year-old elders to 5-year-old boys like me, came to her wedding to gawk. It crowded the wedding chamber. In her traditional Chinese wedding dress, she looked like a bride out of a painting. Her fair skin, beautiful face and graceful figure left a deep impression on 5-year-old me. For years afterward, when people asked what kind of bride I wanted to marry, I always answered someone like my 7th aunt. She would only be in her early 30s now, the prime age for a woman. Normally having her climb onto me at night might have been a pleasant surprise. But the more I thought about it, the more terrified I became. First, the coffin lid was sealed tightly. How did she get in here? Second, her body was ice cold, completely devoid of warmth. Most importantly, I clearly remember that she had died, bleeding to death from childbirth complications. Several years ago, the thought of a dead woman lying on top of me in the coffin made every hair on my body stand on end. Terrified as I was, I managed to stay calm. I remembered the 3 rules Xiao Ju gave me, so I kept my eyes shut, my mouth tightly closed, and didn't look at her. Seeing that I wasn't moving, I lay perfectly still. My 7th aunt chuckled softly. She leaned close to my ear and whispered, letting her remain on top of me. Hu-Jun, why aren't you saying anything? Didn't you always dream as a child of marrying someone like me? Tonight I'll make that dream come true. Her breath was cold as ice, sending shivers down my spine. I clenched my teeth and kept my eyes shut, pretending it was all just a dream. Then she whispered again, didn't you enjoy touching me just now? Why did you stop? Go ahead, touch me. I don't mind. But I didn't dare move. I pretended not to hear her, keeping my eyes and mouth shut. I acted like a corpse. Time dragged on second by second. She kept trying to trick me into speaking, but I held on to the 3 rules Xiao Ju gave me. No matter what, I wouldn't open my eyes or mouth. From time to time, I'd reach out to see if she was still there. I kept checking. Then suddenly I felt lighter. I reached out to touch again. There was nothing there. She was gone. I let out a sigh of relief. But I still didn't open my eyes, afraid of seeing something I shouldn't. I shifted slightly in the coffin, only to realize my entire body was drenched in cold sweat. It was as if I had just climbed out of a river. Eventually I drifted off again. This time I slept until morning. When I woke, the coffin lid had been opened by Xiao Ju. The morning sunlight poured in, blinding me momentarily. Seeing I was awake, Xiao Ju smiled warmly. Awake now? Did you sleep well last night? I replied, sleep well? I almost died in there. Xiao Ju smiled and nodded. I told you the village isn't peaceful at night. She asked me what had happened. Who came to bother you? I told her about the voices I heard. Hers, my parents, and even my grandfather's. Xiao Ju gave me a thumbs up. My future husband is so smart. You didn't fall for their tricks. Then I told her what happened later. How my dead 7th aunt climbed on top of me. She was blowing cold air on me, trying to seduce me. Hearing this, Xiao Ju's expression darkened. Her pale face turned bright red with anger. Hands on her hips, she stomped her foot. That shameless ghost. How dare she think about my man? Does she think that just because she has the 4 spirits' support, she can ignore the Hu family? After cursing, she turned to me seriously. Did you give in to her tricks last night? I asked, confused. What do you mean by that? Xiao Ju explained. Did you do anything with her? I quickly shook my head. Of course not. We're engaged. How could I betray you? I'd never mess around with another woman. Xiao Ju looked pleased with my answer. Out of nowhere, she hugged my face and kissed me. I was embarrassed but felt a little happy inside. Her kiss made my heart flutter. Then she grabbed my hand and pulled me out of the coffin. She dragged me outside, still half asleep. I rubbed my eyes and asked, where are we going so early? Xiao Ju huffed. Where else? We're going to settle a score. I asked, are we going after the 4 spirits for what they did to my grandfather? Xiao Ju shook her head, not yet. We'll deal with them later first. We're going after your 7th aunt. She dared seduce my man. I'm going to tear up her grave. Her words shocked me. I thought she was just joking out of anger. But to my surprise, this girl actually took me to the ancestral graveyard and dug up my 7th aunt's grave.